Menendez. I'm the Director of Account Management at LeadGenius. I like to moderate these panels pretty regularly. If you've been on these panels before, it's still the same person. My hairstyle just dramatically changes from webinar to webinar. But I'd like to take a second to, before we introduce our panelists who are industry experts here on revenue operations, go through some housekeeping items. So the style of this panel discussion is going to be just me asking questions and everyone being able to either answer those, respond to them, go into these discussions. My questions are mainly meant to just guide the conversation. You guys are welcome to ask about any other topic. If you have questions that you want to ask our panelists, we'll dedicate some Q&A time at the very end so you can use that Q&A functionality within Zoom. Okay, spiel over. Let's introduce our panelists. I'm gonna let you guys introduce yourselves this time. And we'll start with Diane. So Diane, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Diane Palmer, and I lead up global planning and insights at Asana. And I have a background of about 15 years and counting in various functions within revenue operations. And it's definitely a passion of mine, so I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. And where are you calling in from?
I'm calling in from Oakland, California.
Very cool. All right. Kyle, you're up next.
Thanks. My name's Kyle, longtime listener, first time caller. I am based out of Bend, Oregon. Background was I started my career as an SDR, moved up into running business operations, ultimately started my own company called Kicksaw. We do turnkey sales ops implementations for companies that just buy Salesforce. And so excited to be here. I have a lot of concepts and topics to talk about on this. So I'm excited to hear other people's perspectives because I like to learn more than anything. So happy to be here.
All right. Thanks, Kyle. And Jake, you're up next.
Hey, what's going on, everyone? I am Jake Dunlap. I'm the CEO of Skaled Consulting, calling in from now warm Austin, Texas. We had quite the week last week. And we are a sales consulting firm. We've worked with thousands of organizations now, helping to optimize various components of their sales organization, operations, and enablement. So excited to add what we've seen in the market and learn from everyone as well, too.
Very cool. Thank you, Jake. And last but most certainly not least, Adam.
Hey everyone, I'm Adam. I'm the VP of Business Operations here at LeadGenius. I've actually been here for about 6 years now. Time sure does fly. We operate out of Berkeley, California. So this is a virtual background, but we're just right across the way from the San Francisco. And I'm calling actually out of the East Bay as well, just like Diane. And it's nice to be back and can't wait to get this discussion started.
Time flies when you're having fun, right, Adam?
Exactly.
Okay, awesome. Well, I'm going to go ahead and kick off this discussion. I'm just going to ask a series of questions, direct them at one individual. You are, again, welcome to answer the question after or ask somebody to elaborate or discuss beyond that. So let's start with Kyle. Kyle, we know revenue operations does a lot. There's a lot in your purview here. But what are the most important aspects of revenue operations, especially now that everyone's remote?
I think the North Star for revenue operations is just making life easier on the teams that you support. Like it's really not that hard if you think about that as your North Star. And then from there, you can break it down into a couple categories. The first one I really think about is like removing rocks from people's shoe is a simple way to describe it. And the easiest way to do that is think about things that suck. Ask your team, what do you not like about the processes you have to follow to close deals, renew them, upsell them, et cetera? Like they'll give you those answers. We oftentimes hear more than we want to hear, but the reality is start with things that suck, remove those rocks in their shoe. The second thing I think about is like finding ways to enable people, right? So most often the simplest way to do that is just shadow people in their job. Just watch an SDR for an hour and see how hard their job is. What can you break down on their behalf? And then the third step I'd say would be try to automate unnecessary work for folks. So much data entry happens in systems. So much is expected of reps to constantly do that if you can find ways to remove a couple percentage points of effort every single day, that pays major dividends. So I think about it as definitely get rid of things that suck, find ways to enable, and then automate a lot of their work. And you're going to put you in the 99th percentile, I'd say, in RevOps.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with the concept of automating repeatable tasks in terms of, getting that all out of the way. I think Adam did a really great job at LeadGenius of creating, and you can speak to it too, of creating like project windshield, right? That concept of like automating a lot of what we do by hand.
Right. And the concept of the reason why I called it Project Windshield was just to plan the fact that we had a very dirty windshield, so we couldn't really see going forward, but we had a great rear view mirror, meaning we could just look at the past and see what we did wrong. So it's all about cleaning the windshield, getting a proactive look into the future, so to make us less reactive to solving issues. And you know, Kyle, I love the rocks out of shoes analogy that you used. You know, I think one of the difficulties there too would be to identify which rocks to remove, because sometimes, you know, there's so much. It's like, how do you actually prioritize that? And I think we're going to talk about that a little bit later as well.
And unfortunately, squeaky wheel gets a grease a lot of times, right? It's just whoever complains the most gets the most help. So I think that's where revenue ops needs to be able to take a step back and say, okay, this person is complaining the most and the loudest, but that's the lowest impact thing we could be doing. So you've got to have some sort of balance there to understand what are people complaining about, but what's also like the forward mirror instead of the rear view, or through the windshield versus the rear view. So you got to balance those things. And I think that's where I think it's important for ops to be separate from sales, separate from customer success. They have to be kind of an independent arbiter to make decisions for the organization, not just a given team. So
definitely. And the only other thing I would add is just like driving alignment across all the teams, which is really important, like acting as that liaison of communication. So again, to identify the rocks and which ones should be prioritized because they affect the most aspects of the business as a whole.
Let me ask this question. It's a little off script here, but how would you, let's say a new RevOps individual is trying to prioritize what those rocks are. How would you give that person advice?
Generally, they're going to need to tie into some sort of organizational goals: driving revenue, reducing churn, renewing business. So first, start with whatever those kind of key metrics are, those KPIs for that RevOps person. Their boss will be helping set them for them, and then break it down into the tasks, or what are the things that prevent you from doing that? What's stopping our team from closing deals? What's stopping us from renewing business, et cetera? Then break those down into smaller chunks. I mean, everybody's heard the concept of take a big problem and break it down into smaller ones, and then from there make decisions. But that's really it. It's not rocket science. It's about discipline and consistency, and trying to just think ahead, look forward instead of backwards is, I think, solves a lot of problems for folks.
I think it's also, I think you also have to go form your own assessment too, right? I think a lot of times what I see is a lot of sales orgs and what are the challenges are defined with a mix of data and gut. And where I feel like RevOps has the best opportunity is to take a more objective, similar to what you're saying, Kyle, you're taking a step back more objectively and saying, okay, let me get my lay of the land and maybe help to shape the priorities. Because I think, at least what I see is where RevOps and different siloed ops become less effective is when they're order takers. And they're like, hey, these are you go fix this stuff. Just you go, we already know what the problems are. And I think the RevOps teams that I see that truly have a seat at the table are the ones that are sometimes prescribing what the issues actually are, or at least, providing a more quantitative view into, I think a lot of times we solve sales challenges based on people's qualitative opinions.
Totally agree. It's a good perspective.
I'd say too, another challenge that we face is around capturing important information, but not, there's going to be this balance of having like the manual entry component of like what you're tracking for reps and automating that for them. And occasionally you're going to have no other choice but to have people manually do things. And I feel like it's sometimes very difficult to come up with the proper balance there of what you need as a goal for metric tracking, as opposed to just getting in the way of the reps' day-to-day activities. So I guess my question for the group too is like, how would you guys balance that specifically? And how would you basically pitch to reps? Because, we don't sell, but part of what we have to do is like sell an operational procedure to reps to get them to do things without pulling too many teeth. So, that's been a challenge for me in the past. And I was just wondering how you guys would solve that.
I want to piggyback off of what Kyle was mentioning. I like to use the phrase doing business internally, because really you want to think about a sales rep navigating the internal organization, very similar to how they're asking their customers to go navigate their businesses, right? Their organizations as they sell. So I always put that sales rep hat on as I think through what they need to navigate. But the flip side is Setting those priorities. You want to think about what's fundamental to the business, what's going to help you scale, because at the end of the day, the reason we talk about automation to begin with is because we want to unload some of that unnecessary or less than sexy work, right? But it's necessary for the business, and really start working on things that are a lot more proactive. So we as a RevOps team have to set a strategy, we have to set our priorities, and we have to get good at saying no. If it doesn't fit those priorities, and if it doesn't meet the needs of the business, if it's only to address that squeaky wheel, or if it's not going to move the needle enough, you know what? Sorry, reps, you're just going to have to live with it, right? But on the flip side, I want to really call out every time I've tried to roll something out, regardless of whether or not it's because a CRO said so or because it's SOX compliance, I always bring it back to what's in it for me. As a rep, this is why we're asking you to do this, and this is how it benefits you at the end of the day. And a lot of times that actually alleviates quite a bit of the squeaky wheel. You're always going to have a few, but we in RevOps have to get comfortable with that, right? Get comfortable with a little bit of discomfort.
In that vein, I love the concept. I'd heard this from a friend who said, like, basically every question that gets asked of them to build would be either hell yes or no. It should be an absolute slam dunk. We definitely need it, or no, because it's so easy to add process and structure and rigidity, but it's very hard to break those things down. So it should be a clearly, yes, we should put this kind of practice in place. It's going to slow folks down because it's so worth it. And I think, where I got frustrated as an individual rep about operations is that it feels like oftentimes operations is focused on managing up. What do executives need? What do managers need? What do they care about, without actually thinking about the reps on the ground who are doing all the work? What do they care about? What can make their lives easier? And so often we manage up and set it down. And I think that it's just as important to manage down.
And to Jake's point earlier, it's like I've actually liked to use like actual quantifiable data to show how it's actually making their life easier. So one example would be around requiring people to put some detail in on their close loss reason of why this deal was lost. They didn't want to do it at first, but then we found that this is really low hanging fruit, especially if it's like a timing reason in terms of budget, where they specifically refer to why they weren't able to purchase 6 months ago, and to re-engage them at a later date. If that information wasn't there, it would be harder to leverage, and reps can actually see the physical deals coming in from that. So this is one way that I've found success in incentivizing the right behavior.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. One area I feel your pain on is where we as RevOps are having to pay off operational or technical debt, right? Sometimes it's hard to explain the what's in it for me, aside from the fact that we as RevOps sometimes have to clean up our own past decisions, past sins, right? And make sure that we're able to scale as an organization as well, in order to get to those bigger things that are much more immediately, obviously impactful. But sometimes we do just have to work behind the scenes, and reps, I need you to trust me. But that goes back to, I'm open and transparent about why we do things, and I'm very careful about what we roll out, so that the reps don't lose trust and credibility in us.
That's actually, it's a good point on what I was getting ready to add, which is the main reason for those gaps, at least what we've seen across our clients and whenever we get brought in, is sometimes where RevOps stops is at the insights phase versus the full-blown deployment phase. And I think so often with a lot of initiatives that RevOps brings to the table, or new initiatives, we spend so much time focusing on the go live, and the reinforcement sucks. And when the reality of is like a real change management project is, what does power usage look like? And I think when people are leading initiatives internally, the biggest reason for failure is we spend so much time focused on the deployment and not the reinforcement at the frontline manager level. And that's where, we talked a lot about getting the frontline reps buy-in. But what I've found is, like, it's the frontline managers buy-in, because they're the ones in the field, and they're the ones who need to make sure the reinforcement happens whenever we see things that go well versus not so well.
Jake, I want to say +1 like times 1,000, because if you don't have that backbone in the sales organization supporting you, that frontline manager, the reps, frankly, they're not going to care, right? They care about what their boss says.
That's right. And if the manager doesn't feel like the manager had something to say or do with it, then they won't reinforce it. And that's 9 times out of 10, we see these big initiatives at companies, that is the fail point. The frontline managers didn't feel like they were involved in the decision making. And so they're like, yeah, I know my boss's boss is telling me to do this, but nah, man, that's not how we run the team. managers would
Definitely agree
never
with that
do
one.
that, of course, right? Of course, managers would never say that, right? Of course, like they would never.
Not out loud.
No, exactly.
I'm going to move on to the next question. This one is actually for Adam. So we have a lot of excuse me, I'm getting a phone call. Let me get rid of it. We have a lot of decentralized operations teams, marketing ops, sales ops, but the trend that we've been seeing is that they're all being combined together into this concept of revenue operations. So why is it important, in your opinion, to centralize operations into one umbrella of revenue ops versus siloed teams?
Yeah, we kind of touched base on the last question too, but it's really around just driving alignment as a business. When the ultimate goal of all the revenue teams is really just to grow revenue as a company. So if you have these siloed departments with different goals and no one to connect the dots in between, that can result in a lot of like negative downstream effects. But one thing to clarify too, it's like I feel like, especially when you have larger companies, it will make sense to have a sales operations person or a marketing operations person to specifically be specialized in that function. But they definitely need some kind of a manager who's like in a RevOps role, such as the people on this call, to really just make sure that their goals are aligned and not aligned purely to like a single department. One example would be around this concept of, Jake was talking about this before, MQLs, right? Marketing have a goal of bringing in 10,000 MQLs, but if none of those MQLs convert, none of them are qualified by sales, none of them are equal closed deals, it really doesn't mean anything. So to basically, to ensure that you're actually bringing in the right KPIs, tracking the right KPIs, and defining which each metric is, it's really important just to like centralize it into a single function.
What I would add to this is that what I've seen is oftentimes an early hire for a VP of sales when they're starting to grow as an ops person, just to be their right-hand guy or gal, just to help, my sales reps having issues with Salesforce, go break that down. And, what ends up happening is that ops person helps the VP of sales cut corners, right? They don't actually create processes for the organization. They're creating processes or methods of getting deals across the finish line. And I think operations, again, needs to be removed one step, but you may want a person dedicated to the sales team in that context to help them break down barriers where it makes sense. But it shouldn't be you report to the VP of sales, because then your only goal is to help deals get closed because the VP of sales likes that, versus as an operational team, your goal is for the organization to be successful. It's not, are we closing deals, but are we closing good deals? Are they going to pay us? Do we have all the data we need, right? There's a certain level of abstraction you need to remove the ops person from it so they can make objective decisions instead of just what my boss is yelling at me for to get this deal across the line because it's 11 o'clock on the 31st of the year or something like that. So
I would say on top of that, the MQL piece is a really important interlock, I think, that needs to happen. And it's what we are trying to solve with RevOps. But really, at the end of the day, we need to understand mapping the entire business process or the lead lifecycle, for example, from start to finish, and understand who owns the relationship and who owns each of the handoffs. That also requires marketing ops and sales ops to talk together and to figure out what that looks like from a systems perspective, whether they live centrally in a RevOps organization or they live decentralized and reporting up into different silos. You still can come together, but it is so critical to have good leadership. Adam, I know that's really where you were headed, right? Is you need somebody at the top, regardless of where they're at, to be able to say, this is a priority and I need everybody to work together on this, right? I think that is so critical. People need to just talk to each other. We can systematize this and automate as much as we like to, but if human beings don't talk to each other, they're rarely going to be on the same page.
Yeah, I really like what Kyle was saying earlier when he was talking about, well, a new VP of sales will come in and just have a right-hand man, which I think is the reason why this entire centralized revenue operations team became a thing, right? Is that marketing operations is a function of marketing to help support the marketing team. Sales operations is a function of sales to help support the sales team. But ultimately they roll up to this one revenue operations function that has the organization's goals in mind versus, taking orders from the marketing CMO or the CRO or whatever it is.
Yeah, and you'll end up, when you do that, you'll end up with the marketing ops folks will go add a bunch of functionality that doesn't jive with what the sales team is trying to do. And those things don't marry up very well. And all of a sudden, again, we're working in silos and we're back to where we started.
That is so spot on. It's like I feel like a lot of RevOps is created because groups just don't collaborate very well, or they have misaligned incentives. Whereas like we created these individual operations roles, and now we need an operations role for our operations teams because of this constant segmentation of roles and dysfunction. And I think that's a big reason why I think people are creating these roles. My fear with RevOps as a category, RevOps to me is like the newest version of ABM. It's like every sales org is talking about RevOps, but if like the things we said, if you don't have buy-in from the top, there's not, they don't have a seat at the table. It's the same dysfunctions keep happening. And so to me, RevOps is, RevOps has to have a seat at the table and the ability to make changes, or the things that we're talking about don't actually ever get solved with the RevOps teams. You just check a box. You're like, I don't know, we have RevOps. They're working across groups, but they're not doing anything.
Yeah.
But they just end up as order takers, right?
And it's the same problem all over again. Exactly.
Yeah. I'm going to move on to the next question. This one actually is for Jake and is near and dear to my heart, clearly, as someone who's in a customer experience role. But what are some of the best ways that a revenue operations team can contribute to a seamless customer experience?
I mean, it's hopefully it's a big priority for that team, right? I think so often as we architect sales organizations and even roles, we really think about internal experience versus the ultimate experience, which is your customer's experience. So to me, I feel like the big a mistake that RevOps can make that would lead them to not doing very well at their job is to not also be mapping the customer experience the same way you're mapping the sales experience. I think so often we take a internal view of the sales process versus an external view of the customer journey. And really, it is actually, I would argue, it's better to align to the optimal customer journey than it is to fixing sales challenges, as opposed to how can I make that experience more effective by the way that our organization interacts at key moments, to then shrink the cycle, keep people happy, then doing the same thing once they become a customer. So I feel like RevOps to be successful has to not just look at the internal, they've got to go sit in on meetings, sit in on customer calls, go and get dirty and really understand the customer experience just as much as the internal experience.
Jake, I would add on top of that, I think that's a great description. The way I even used the language earlier is a good example of how that's siloed and it's disconnected, right? I talked about lead life cycle, then you've got the sales process or sales cycle, and then you've got a post-sales cycle. But what's missing in that language is the umbrella that all of that lives under, which is the customer life cycle, the customer journey. And if we're not anchoring to that, we're going to miss that every single time. And the customer is going to feel like they're not the most important thing. And when in reality, to steal a little bit of verbiage from AWS, our customer has to be our obsession. We have to anchor everything off of our customer.
Just +1 for me on that one, but I'm biased. I mean, let me ask this question though. And Adam, I think you might have a really good perspective on this because Adam went from a really heavy, internal operations focused role, and now his responsibilities have shifted to also include some being on more customer calls. Essentially, I won't go into too much detail about it. But Adam, has that shifted your perspective a little bit on the way that like your RevOps team can contribute to that customer experience?
It hasn't really shifted my perspective. Definitely my priorities changed in terms of what we're really trying to improve. One thing I would add is I feel like it's also really important to understand what you're selling, even if you're not a seller, and like really understand the product. Because then the more you understand about the product, the more you understand about how it fits into your customers' needs, as to what Jake was saying. One
exercise I'd recommend for folks getting into RevOps is practice buying tools and stuff. See what it's like to be a buyer. What sucks about being a buyer? Like, what did you like about the sales process that we could poach and include in ours? And I think so often layers of management will try to, for some reason, do things that make it hard to buy your product. We have really complex pricing structures that don't make any sense when you just look at it. You want to simplify that process as much as possible. And I think one of the easiest way to do it is look to your left and right and see what other companies are doing like you, see what it's like to buy and figure out what you like and what you don't like, and use that as a method of identifying internal problems that you've got that you could tighten up as well. So practicing buying things is a great way to learn how to sell.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, and it ups your street cred. right? That is why so many enablement and ops teams get smoked so often, is they're like, dude, they have no clue what the heck's going on here.
You've never sold
Like,
anything.
They don't know what to do. Or you sold things a year ago and you're still relying on that street cred. And they're like, man, this person hadn't been in the field for how long? Come on, man. Take this somewhere else, Kyle. We're not trying to listen to this stuff, right? So it's like, if you've got to stay fresh. You know, customer behavior is changing at a rate it has never changed this quickly. And so I feel like ops in particular is, man, there's just so much. There's so much to keep up with. But the only path is to continue to keep up with all these changes and things that are happening from a tool set standpoint and an experience standpoint.
Jake, I will say, as a person who technically has never carried a bag, I'm so sensitive to that point. And so the way I overcome that is I make sure I listen to my stakeholders, right? I bring them to the table and I tell them, look, these are my operational priorities and this is what I need to accomplish. What is your take, right? And so I make sure that their voice, their fingerprints are on that. And then to go back to an earlier part of our conversation, I also make sure that frontline manager is really bought in so that they feel like they own some of that, and they can, because the frontline leader is also going to have to do a job of taking the corporate strategy or whatever it is I'm trying to roll out and translate it down to the reps. Yes, I can talk about what's in it for me, but they're just going to turn around and ask their manager or their leadership team, why are we doing this, right? I need to better understand from you. And so if I have them at the table and I have them as part of the process, I've increased my credibility already without having to have to carry a bag. Understanding I don't know what that's like, right? So I have a ton of empathy for how hard it is to sell and how hard it is to generate interest and leads and inquiries and how to keep a customer, right? Because we're thinking about the full life cycle. So I really make sure that I'm not thinking about things in a silo myself.
And it's easy to start thinking in a silo when as an ops person, you may be thinking about opportunity stages for months and months and months and months, and sales reps or SDRs don't ever think about it. And so in your mind, it's so obvious what the path forward is, but how you communicate all the knowledge you've gained is a really hard thing to do and get their buy-in. And I think sometimes we have to understand, like, the people that we're supporting really don't care about all this operational stuff. They just want to do their job. And so you've got to find that balance, it feels like.
And you've got to inject it into your RevOps. As your RevOps team grows, you got to inject it into the team, because that's the next disconnect I see, is that there's an alignment at the RevOps and the executive or middle level, but the team is just executing blindly. And so I feel like that is the next gap that I see, is like, even when you have a really high functioning and everyone's aligned and they've got a seat at the table, I still see dysfunction when the teams themselves aren't bought in, or they haven't done some of the things we're talking about, or, so you've got to keep your team fresh too as a part of this. I feel like that to me is a big gap, where if they're just executing here, then your RevOps team is actually still in a silo because they're just kind of executing some high level priorities that maybe they don't fully understand either.
The long-term detriment to that too is if you're thinking about succession planning and about how to grow your organization, if you've got a whole group of people who don't understand how to connect those dots, what are you as a leadership team going to do? You have to think about how to scale everybody up within the organization.
Not to be confused with Skaled on Jake's sweater.
Right.
It plays.
Yeah, with a C.
Okay, so the next question actually is for Diane. You guys keep ending off on the right person. The next person who's going to speak is the last person to have spoken, which is great. But this is for you, Diane. It feels like we're overrun with massive amounts of data. So how do you prioritize an action on marketing, customer, and sales data?
Yeah, this one is near and dear to my heart. I think I use that phrase a lot, so maybe all of this is near and dear to my heart. But I ask some really basic questions about data. First of all, data is amazing, but there's a ton of data. And as you get higher up in your career and in management, it's extremely easy to become overwhelmed by it and you don't know what to do with it. So I lean on the 5 W's, slightly different word here. But the first thing I ask is, what's the purpose of the data, right? What is it that we're going to measure? What action are we trying to take? What behavior are we trying to drive? And what is the expected outcome, right? So once I have those questions, then I can start to understand who is the audience, who takes action on this, when do we review this data? We want to develop a cadence around this. And as we develop a cadence, then we start to suss out, okay, the KPIs we asked for 6 months ago, we're no longer reviewing those. Let's deprecate those, right? Going back to wanting to say no. We also want to make sure as we take on new things, we stop doing some things that we had been doing previously. And to go back to what we talked about previously, where do we automate? If this is something that's really core and critical to the business, why am I running it every week by myself manually in a spreadsheet with macros and formulas, right? That's silly. So let's think about how we can automate this so that it's literally just self-serve. An exec or an AE or a marketer or anybody can just go to their dashboard, hit refresh, they know exactly what they need to do with it. And then finally, why do we even need to know? I totally get that we want to be curious and data can answer a lot of questions, but not all questions are created equally. And so I always come back to the why. And a lot of times we ask for extra data because we don't know what good looks like. And so part of this exercise is you've got to start creating some baselines, even if you're just kind of guessing at the baselines, right? Set them, try to measure against them, and that's going to really inform how you use the data going forward. And before you know it, you're no longer just order taking on new reports, new KPIs. Meanwhile, you've got a mountain of KPIs and data around you that's not being used. Now you're starting to be more strategic, and now you're starting to have really good conversations with your stakeholders.
I was just going to say the word KPIs. You cannot have 10 or 15. Therefore, they are no longer KPIs.
Yep.
KPIs by definition should be like a few. And I think it's such a beautiful point that, and I think so many people like that is exactly where I see organizations get bogged down is if everything is a priority, then nothing is a priority.
That's right.
And that is, I love that. I mean, that's where I think RevOps kind of does so much value is that idea of like, these are the 3 things that are the most important. And this is what we're managing the business to versus these 15 things that we're tracking that really these 6 of them are, either leads to the legs or just not consequential to, the outcomes we want to drive.
And something that Diane said earlier, where, why is that data important? Like, is that really necessary? Is a big question. Even I ask in my role as an account manager to customers that I work with that ask me for, tons and tons of data. It's like, hold on, slow down, take a step back. Why do you need that data? Is it super critical to, what our goal is here? And do we even need that? Do we need to bog down our database, our CRM with data that is just nice to have, right?
If you funnel that into a 2x2, right, as far as what's urgent and important, you'll often find it's not important, not urgent. And then you really have to beg the question, why are we looking at this? I get that it's kind of cool to see it, but if that's all you have in response to seeing is, oh, okay, cool. Maybe you didn't need it.
Yeah. I want to pose the same question to Adam and Kyle. How do you prioritize an action on, customer marketing and sales data?
I think first it's got to tie into a given KPI, right? Your KPI is what you're looking to solve for, and data is a mechanism of reinforcing your assumptions or the path forward. So I think like you got to figure out, make sure you're not having a tail wag the dog to an extent. A lot of times people are like, I just found some information. Turns out our certain rate is X versus Y. So let's make that change. And it's like, we got to figure out what we're trying to solve for here before we just take data and apply it to something. Because it's, if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And I think it's important to take a step back and figure out what are we trying to answer at any given point, and does the data support that or reject that in that sense.
Yeah, I'll totally agree with what's been said. I don't have too much down on top of it actually, but yeah, just really identify your KPIs. I think the biggest takeaway from Jake is just around not having too many KPIs, or else it means nothing. And just making it accessible after you surface those to all the teams involved. So they have very clear visibility and action items based off of those.
And I would add to that, don't change them all the time. If they're key, let them be key for a while, right?
Right.
Change them every week, every quarter.
I love that.
Really give yourself enough time to action against it to get real insights, right? So hold on to it. Make sure you stick with it for a little bit, and then, but you know what? Decide that up front. This is going to be our KPI for the fiscal year. This is going to be our KPI for the next 4 fiscal, whatever, right? But really stick to that boundary, and then figure out a cadence about reviewing and understanding, right? So that you can decide, okay, maybe that wasn't the right KPI, but this is the process we will follow to adjust and to rethink it, right? But don't have ADD about it.
It's, I mean, look, as a CEO, I'm laughing because I'm like, I definitely do that sometimes. But I've just seen it. I mean, I've seen it over the years, like this, the easier to understand, the more the 2 to 3 and the keeping everyone in line. I think that that's probably one of the more tactical takeaways we've discussed that will have a massive impact on, sales organizations. It's like when you have one North Star, there's 2 to 3 max versus, we're trying to do 17 things or switching them constantly is a recipe for, people just like never really, what I've seen is people just don't buy into this solution because they think something's going to change in 3 to 6 months anyway. And so when you create that culture in your sales org of this constantly shifting KPIs, you never really fully get buy-in, even when you do land on those 2 or 3.
Yeah, it's like we're our own worst enemy. Like we're the ones who did this, and then we changed it, and we changed it, and we changed it. Now all of a sudden we're frustrated that everybody's not buying into all this constant change.
Yeah, pretty hard to hit a moving target, right? All right, next question. This one is for you, Kyle. And I've heard, just some background on this question. I've heard Jake answer this question several times. I really liked his response to it, but it's always a question that, has been on everyone's mind for about a year now. How do you keep a remote go-to-market team on track? I can vouch personally for people who are in a go-to-market role and in a sales role that we can get distracted very easily.
Yeah, it's hard, and we're also living in the land of Slack and just constant notifications and distraction and not like deep focused work, right? We want our teams to be executing thoroughly, but we and they and everyone creates this kind of culture of constant distraction, being like a squirrel going from thing to thing. And, Kicksaw, we've been lucky through the pandemic in that we were 100% remote pre-pandemic. So it wasn't a big change for us. A lot of our competitors were switching to remote and they just couldn't put those pieces in place. So we had wind at our back in that sense. So that made our lives easier. I think this kind of goes back to what we're talking about with KPIs is we need to figure out how do we simplify things, right? If you make things complex on people or you add too many KPIs like we were just talking about, I think that is a recipe to have your team struggle through being 100% remote. I think from a strategic perspective, the first thing is setting really clear expectations for your team. This is what we're looking to accomplish. These are our North Stars. Again, we're kind of rehashing the same kind of question or answers at the same time. Mm-hmm. And, as your team is executing within that, you need to give them the tools to understand and measure their performance. Like, how are they doing relative to their peers to the right and left? And are they actually still on track? And then third is just get out of their way. I think being remote, as a manager, we feel like we want to inject ourselves and make sure everyone's okay, get in there and check in. The reality is, if you've got the right people in the right seats with the right enablement, let them go and make sure that those bumpers in the bowling alley are keeping them going down versus like going off the rails. So I think that's it, is set clear expectations, measure their performance, and just get out of their way.
Yeah, I definitely like to leverage leaderboards for that. That's a positive thing about just, a friendly competition between your peers, especially with sales reps, that no one wants to be at the bottom of a leaderboard. So it kind of helps in just managing their own day-to-day activities. But also I would call them like reverse leaderboards, as in kind of the casual term would be kind of like a shit list of a dashboard where it kind of measures, you don't want to be at the top of this leaderboard. It means you haven't taken care of like your daily activities. But just by displaying that and centralizing all the metrics in a place where people can view, cuts down a lot of the micromanagement that you would normally have or you would try to do to get people to do things. Because it just naturally, no one wants to be at the top of the bad leaderboard. Everyone wants to be at the top of the good leaderboard.
One additional thing we're going through. Oh, sorry. Did I interrupt?
No, go ahead. Go ahead, Kyle.
I was going to say one thing we're going through the exercise of putting in place right now is trying to remove distractions. I mentioned Slack. That's a big one generally for a lot of companies, but also, we've noticed a lot of meeting creep, just more and more and more meetings that are taking people away from actually doing their job. And so we're trying to really reduce unnecessary meetings, but also on the flip side of that, we're trying to set time specifically to be distracted, which is we have specific happy hours. We have water cooler time where people can go and really check out, not have to talk about their sales pipeline or what's coming up next. It's just talk about life so that when you go back to work, you're focused on that. So you kind of have an outlet to really be distracted, but then and the ability to be really focused on your job when you're not.
Yeah, I mean, I would also say that I think it's, I think having that true North Star, like being able to clearly report on the goals of the company is probably a great contributing factor that anyone in revenue operations can provide in terms of value and like keeping remote teams on track. So even, I mean, like, you know, even in our organization, our revenue operations manager who reports up to Adam contributes a lot culturally to us staying on track, because on a regular basis, he reports wins. He reports how close we are to our goal. And like, I think that keeps people motivated. I think that keeps people going here. All right, so I have one final question. But before I ask this one final question, I want to invite any of our panelists or any of our attendees, excuse me, to go ahead and use that Q&A function. After this question, we'll move on to Q&A. So if you have any, we already have some that are coming in. And if you have any others, feel free to type them in. But now I just want to give you all the time to shout out some of your favorite tools. I mean, I feel like revenue operations is a big buyer and you guys use a lot of really great tools. So some of the best tools that, you know, have made your life easier that you want to give them a good shout out. And, you know, you don't have to say LeadGenius, but like
LeadGenius. Right. That's that obvious. That's a given one. I'll give a quick shout out to one. You know, again, a lot of, and I'm sure folks are going to bring up some data visualization tools, but Insight Squared out of the box, I've found provides a lot of kind of hidden insights around what I find is the issue with data, especially as your teams get big, is everything looks pretty in a chart, but when you start to zoom in at the rep or the manager level, it's a nightmare. And specifically, what I like about Insight Squared is there's two metrics, which is average sales cycle by rep by stage, and average conversion percentage by rep by stage, that really enables better coaching conversations, better ways that you can unlock what the actual gaps are at the, not just the company level, but at the manager and individual level. So I'll give a quick shout to Insight Squared, because again, I think it gets you that granular data and you don't have to search for that info.
No, I really like any kind of those call transcription software. Like we use Gong. There's also like Chorus. You know, in terms of what we discussed earlier about like sitting on calls or looking over like the BDR's daily workflow to get a feel for what they're actually doing. I feel like it's really important for coaching, and also from an ops perspective, like understanding what they go through and how to adjust their pains. I also like to shout out Retool. It's one of my favorite apps right now. It's basically like a way to, it's not really a BI tool as its only function, but I actually use it a lot for BI, but also to build apps that are actually editable, so they can basically interact with like a database such as Salesforce and make edits through another platform. It's just extremely useful. And then just a shameless plug, and I wouldn't say this if I didn't actually mean it, but like LeadGenius is actually really great for my operational needs on a day-to-day basis. Especially when we talk about like the quality of data and making sure that we're emphasizing quality over quantity. It just makes sure that it ensures that the reps are adding in data that's most actionable. And we're actually like targeting personalized insights as opposed to just mapping the whole world and with a bunch of like inaccurate information. We also have a new Chrome extension that our reps use, and that's also helping with our just overall data hygiene. Mace, maybe we can put like a link for people if they want to just check it out. It's a free Chrome extension right now. Download and give it a whirl.
So I'll give a shout out to a vendor I worked with in a previous life, People AI. What they do is automatic contact and activity capture. And that sounds super simple, and it is. The actual act of capturing that is really simple. But what really blew me away and why I'm such a big proponent, if you choose to use a different vendor, there are some others out there as well, but essentially, automatically capturing activity from a rep or a post-sales person and tying it back to an opportunity or an account gives you such amazing insights, not because you want to micromanage, because now you can start to tie that activity data back to what good looks like. And from a rep perspective, did you hit quota, right? So what kind of activity do you have tied to quota attainment? And all of a sudden you've got some really incredible insights that then turn around and allow you to be able to coach, right? You arm that frontline sales manager with those insights. Now they can have really meaningful conversations with data and say, look, good reps like you, if you want to close more 100K deals and you want to be like that on your leaderboard, you need to have these kinds of activities, and I'm here to help you with that, right? It's not because I'm trying to beat you up with, did you have X number of calls or did you send X number of emails? It's more, let's talk about how to make it better, right? And get ahead. And that becomes a leading indicator to things like pipeline build. And pipeline build is a leading indicator to ARR booked, right? So that's just the sales component of it. Automatic contact capture and then contact association to an opportunity in turn helps with marketing attribution. So that is super key. If you want to make sure you're making the right investments from a marketing perspective, you need to know which people are involved in a deal, right? And what campaigns they might be associated with. So really basic stuff, but some incredible insight. So big shout out to anyone who wants to take a look at those kinds of features. They're really amazing.
And that ties back into the concept of automation, like we were just talking about. Just automate all that work of connecting contacts to opportunities. So you don't have to have your reps doing that. So that's an awesome shout out for sure. What we're using at Kicksaw as of late that have been really helpful are, I'm thinking of it kind of in a different way. Is like, I'm thinking this more in a strategic perspective of like, how am I planning, our operations within the organization? And Miro has been a really good tool for us as of late. We use it for kind of mind mapping a lot of stuff. So we've been using that a ton. I was a hater on it for a long time, and I just came around in the last month or so. And then we've been using Notion, if folks use Notion, for kind of creating internal wikis of all, we do really complex Salesforce implementations for companies. We're trying to take a best practice here and apply it to 30 other implementations we're doing. And we call them SOPs for standard operating procedures. Company wants lead attribution, or they want velocity tracking on opportunities. We have one way of building it, and we kind of cookie cutter that to every implementation that we do. So those two tools have really made that process simple. And thinking about it from an ops side, just having a standard repository of shortcuts and methods that we are going to apply in all these scenarios have been really helpful for us.
Very cool. All right. Well, thank you guys so much. I do have a couple of questions for you that came in through the Q&A, so I'll go through them. One of the questions is, what are the top 3 things you guys hear sales reps continuously asking for? And how did you prioritize which ones were critical? And then follow up, how did you implement them?
I can try to take the implementation part. With any big initiatives, there's a framework actually Bain developed called Rapid, and where basically it's a decision-making framework for who's going to be the recommender, I'm going to blank on the input, who's going to perform, the input, and then the final decision maker. What is A? Dang it. Rapid. We literally use this every day, so of course I can't remember. Approver. That's exactly what it is. Approval. That's exactly what it is. But anyway, my whole point is that the problem with any type of initiative is like cook, kitchen, like they're all there. What a rapid framework does when you do it up front is it just very clearly like lays out the decision-making process. So as you make decisions, you can move really quickly. So for me on the implementation front, again, I talked before, like that's where I'm obsessed, because the devil's in the details on the deployment. And that's all that matters to me. Is use a rapid framework or something to where you get a really clear process for how you're going to make decisions and how you're going to make decisions on everything from the work that needs to be done to the deployment. But I found that just makes things just like beautiful and simple when you have that up front.
I feel like I hear sales reps historically in past jobs when I managed folks, especially SDRs, they're tired of how complex it is to interface with Salesforce. I've got all these fields to enter. I've got all these things that bog me down. So it's generally complaints about how hard it is to do their job. That's like the number one is like, again, it's why it really biases me towards simplifying things. Is I just heard so many complaints of folks complain about how hard it was. And I just felt like this could be easier. So that's my number one, that's kind of my North Star, is just simplify.
I 100% agree with that, Kyle. It's really just about reducing the number of clicks from 3 to 1, or all clicks if it's something
a simple one is just like how complex your page layouts are. We get Salesforce implementations where a customer has 500 fields on the opportunity page layout. So you literally can't add any more. But the first question is, why do you have all these? No one even cares about 99% of these anyways. The sales rep just wants to close a deal. So again, if you can simplify, streamline, make their jobs easier, it's going to help.
Kyle, how many of those fields on the 500 field page layout have things like X's in front because nobody
totally.
Them anymore?
Yeah. Or a Z underscore, so it moves it to the bottom of the list in the thing, so you get it out. Yeah, all those things totally. Yeah, it's unfortunate.
Yeah. One thing that I have gotten a lot of noise from in the past is if you happen to segment your AEs territories by a specific data point, call it customers, a number of employees or something like that, then all of a sudden data to enrich those accounts becomes really important, right? So I've heard a lot of noise specifically about needing to get more data sources because I like this one better than I like that one. But what I have had to do is really just declare, look, these are the top things. I'll use employees as an example because that's come up a few times in previous lives, is that we just have to make a declaration as a business that one, there's no perfect data source, doesn't exist, right? And two, this is how we're prioritizing the data sources that we have. And three, if it doesn't fit in any of those, we have a framework for how to decide to assign those accounts out, but we're going to stick to it, right? And that simplicity solves for 80 to 90, even more, of the noise or the thrash that we hear. And if people understand what boundaries they need to play in, chances are they're going to move on to something else, and hopefully that's selling.
Also wanted to just provide a quick shout out to Kyle. Kyle has actually helped us a lot with just simplifying our process in the beginning. We couldn't have done it without you. So if you need a 100% expert on Salesforce process, just sales process automation, he's definitely a great resource there.
Appreciate it.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. So the question reads, Kyle brought up a great point earlier, getting lots of shout outs, Kyle, about actually taking the time to sit and understand a salesperson's process alongside them. If I'm new to my ops role, what are the things you're looking for? Can you give an example of how you've done this yourself, what you spotted as a bottleneck or problem, and how you solved it?
Yeah, great question. I was kind of unclear in my previous answer, but where that came from was I used to manage a team of SDRs, and the team grew from 7 to 75 in a couple of years. So there was a lot of lessons learned about how to manage SDRs. And what I always found was the simplest way to identify the problems they ran into is I would literally just sit behind them for 30 minutes, back when pre-COVID. Just watch them prospect for 30 minutes. Your goals were X number per day. If you can't get within that ratio in 30 minutes, then there's something probably wrong, right? If you're less efficient when I'm sitting behind you, what's changing? So, I would shadow them and just see, in the ideal world, I'll use prospecting as the example. You're finding an account, you're finding contacts, you're sending an email, blah, blah, blah. And if they're getting hung up on a specific area, that's where I want to learn, how do we optimize? So an area where we would run into challenges where, how do I find this person's email, right? They're email guessers, or, early back in 2010, we would plug them into Gmail, like every single permutation of an email and try to find it. But guess what? There's a tool like Hunter that will just do all that for you. So it's, first figure out what the problem is that your team is running into, the rock in their shoe, and then find a tool that solves that one thing. And then all of a sudden they never have to worry about it anymore. So SDR and that whole sales development process really biases my perspective, because they're the ones doing the most manual data entry all the time. It's a really manual job. And if you can find ways to move the needle 1 or 2%, that's a huge gain in effectiveness and, productivity for them. So that's kind of how I tackle it.
Yeah, I'll open that question up to everyone else on the panel as well. If you've, seen or sat behind a salesperson or kind of learned their sales process and then solved for a bottleneck, what did that look like?
I have gone pretty old school. I love process maps. I really do, because once you start to document, and by the way you get the input to do that is you interview people. So either you sit there and shadow them and you watch them, or you just ask them, how do you do your day job, right? Tell me from start to finish exactly what you need to do, where you're clicking, what sources you're using, what hacks have you come up with to get around things, right? And what's a pain. But start to document that with swim lanes, who's doing what tools are they touching, what documents are they producing? And all of a sudden it becomes really clear, oh, we spend 20 minutes in this cycle right here because we can't get this one answer. And from a systems or process perspective, now I have clarity from an operations side to actually go fix that. Chances are it's a multiple number of bottlenecks, but I don't have that clarity if I don't actually map it out. So you got to go a little old school some days and actually document the entire process.
Yeah, because normally it's stuck in someone's head. Someone has an idea of what the process is, but no one's actually documented or confirmed that we stick to it.
Yeah, and on top of that, if that person wins the lottery, what are you going to do as a company?
I use hit by a bus as an example, but that's maybe a
I
better
like to be a little nice.
Yeah, I like that.
The positivity of the lotteries, you know. Well, okay, one more question that came in, and I'll ask this, and if you guys need to drop, I apologize, you can do so. But we were asked, is there a difference in RevOps support / structure for sales in a CS org?
I don't think so. To go back to Adam's point earlier, yes, you're going to have some people specialize, but the way that those specializations really interact and come back together really is about talking to each other and making sure you're aligned to the same priorities, and ultimately you're mapping it all back to the customer journey, right? So if we've got a good understanding of what that customer journey looks like, then operationally speaking, you can go from inquiry, right, all the way at the very beginning of the marketing lifecycle down to the very end where it's time to renew, right? And customer success is really heavily involved in making sure that customer stays.
Yeah, I mean, coming from a customer success role, I will say that it can be a pretty similar process in terms of how we're supported operationally, because customer success is the concept of repeatedly selling the product or the service back to that customer. And we're going to need pretty much the same type of support. So that's just from my perspective. And then we have a LinkedIn question that just came in. It says, cheers from Ensenada. Question for all, how many KPIs would be enough per department?
3,
3.
4.
Yeah.
3, 4 max, but I would really challenge to get down to 2 to 3.
Yeah, I agree with that. Okay, excellent. Well, I think that rounds out all these questions. We did have one more. Somebody wanted to know what everyone had for dinner last night, but we'll skip that. I want to thank all of our panelists for jumping on. I want to thank you guys for answering questions. Thank you to the audience for asking such thoughtful questions, and keep up to date on the LeadGenius LinkedIn for any more panel discussions. We do different topics. Sometimes we reiterate on topics such as this one. But again, thank you so much for your time and your expertise. Have a wonderful week. We'll talk to you later.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.